Kelly's Taboo Terrors presents Visceral Pleasure and Extreme Cinema 2. Since last year's event was such a rousing success, I decided to continue on with the tradition of bringing together all women to discuss a favorite subgenre of mine, and that's extreme horror. Hey folks, I'm Kelly from Spinsters of Horror, and not only do I write for our website at spinstersofhorror.com, also write for other publications, but my co-host Jessica and I have a monthly horror podcast called I Spit on Your Podcast. I created Taboo Terrors a few years ago because I found myself drifting more and more towards these very transgressive, intriguing, and disturbing films. Content and trigger warnings ahead. If you know anything about Kelly's Taboo Terrors, then I hope you know what you're getting into. But I want to remind folks that there will be discussions of themes and films that might be upsetting for some viewers. Topics such as sexual assault, violence, torture, necrophilia, and more will be mentioned. Viewers' dismemberment is strongly advised. So this is panel number 2 out of 4 for this weekend's festivities. And this one is called Cultural Extremism. Labeled torture or suffer porn, extreme horror films that depict intense violence, brutality, and depravity are often misunderstood and their cultural context ignored. Many of these films in this reviled subgenre of horror come from countries foreign to our own in North America. These countries have cultures that treat both their citizens and animals differently, as well as being haunted by their past or continue to live in treacherous, constrained times. In this panel, we will be discussing A Serbian Film, Atroz and Trauma, films hailing from Serbia, Mexico, and Chile, countries with dark underbellies and political atrocities in which these filmmakers don't shy away from exposing the truth. So I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one. First up is Kelly McNeely. Kelly is a tea-drinking, craft-making, machete-wielding screen junkie with a mostly healthy obsession with horror, 90s action films, and spooky home decor. She's a senior writer at iHorror.com, makes regular appearances discussing her top horror picks on The List TV, and has contributed to CG Magazine, 1428 Elm, Modern Horrors, and Grim Magazine. Kelly co-hosts the Murmurs from the Morgue podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts, and can be found making festive housewares and creepy cocktails at the Creepy Crafter, on Facebook. Hey, Kelly.
Hello, Kelly.
My next guest is Lydia Peever. Lydia Peever is a horror author and bookworm living in Ottawa, Ontario. Her debut novel, Nightface, was published in 2011, and her short stories have appeared in Postscripts to Darkness, Dark Moon Digest, For When the Veil Drops, Memento Mori, The Wicked Library, and her collected series, Pray Lied Eve. In her spare time, she updates the new release section of the Horror Writers Association website, co-hosts the Dead Air podcast, and talks horror books on YouTube at Typical Books. Being a big fan of horror music, books, and film, anywhere there is blood, you will probably find her lurking in the corner. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, that's what I do is lurk. But yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. And our other ghost? No, not a ghost yet. Our other guest is Zoe Rose Smith. Zoe is a film journalist and founder of Zobo with a Shotgun website, podcast, and YouTube channel. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of Ghouls Magazine, an online magazine focusing on horror through the female perspective. Her work has been featured in Daily Grindhouse, Tetra Video Films, Second Sight Films on The Guest, and Dog Soldiers, Hear Us Scream, and more. Her specialty lies in anything extreme with a penchant for nasty, gory, and controversial films and books. We, in theory, do have a fourth panelist named Vivian. Hopefully she joins us soon. But we will jump forward. I am your host, Kelly, like I said. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss, and I can't wait to hear all of your insights and you folks discuss some of my favorite films and this favorite subject of mine. So the first question, folks, that I have for you, and then people that are in the audience, the viewers, the spectators, if you have questions, I'll be opening up for your questions at the end of my questions later on. So the first question is cultural extremism. A genre I like to say that I coined this term. I made it up, but it's a term that I've used to describe these types of films. Films that are politically charged. There's a lot of historical context. Films that are just deeply rooted in the countries they are born from. So, folks on the panel, what are your initial thoughts on these politically charged films? And I will start things off with Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. So I think that there's a wonderful quote by Wes Craven that says, horror films don't create fear, they release it. And I think that cultural extremism, as you like to call it, is a fantastic way to kind of explore that. I think as a subgenre, it's also a great way to sort of encourage further investigation and education when it comes to learning about the cultural context behind these films. And it also kind of challenges its audience by making them kind of confront those dark realities of humanity and the history and all the horrible things that humans have done to each other. So I think that, again, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I know you and I have had this conversation many, many times. I'm very excited to continue that conversation and discuss, that these films are really messed up, but for good reasons.
Excellent. How about you, Lydia?
That is a fantastic term. And I mean, when you're talking about extreme as far as the full genre, a lot of the films are kind of fun. Like, let's not, beat around the bush. There's some that are fun and gonzo and kind of comedic. This particular subgenre, though, there's like really very little comedy to be had. You'd have to be a very hardened veteran of extreme film to get a chuckle out of any aspect of these films. They're all so like unbelievably dark, really, as far as the subgenre goes. And so I think cultural extremism is a really good term because there's a lot of films like Hostel or something that has a certain cultural aspect, or my brain is melting.
But I'll jump in and say Eli Roth, not from those countries, as far as I know. So there's going to be
or Cannibal Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain like tourism aspect to them, but it's very surface level. With films like this, though, we're getting into some very dark histories, some very stark street level culture that we don't see in North America. And it really does shine a light because a lot of them are based on real life events. And nothing is scarier than the news in any country, really. So putting it on the screen like this with the special effects that we've come to know and love, that brings it to a whole new level than any other horror film outside of extreme could ever do.
Love that. Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. Zoe, cultural extremism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty amazing kind of subgenre. As Lydia mentioned, it's very dark, it's very disturbing. It's quite different to a lot of the other stuff, but I think extreme cinema is the perfect place to build out these political pieces of storytelling. And I think, in regards to what they kind of like cover and the topics they cover, they immediately fall within that kind of like horror, that horror subject, just because of the fact that they cover those real life horrors. I don't think, if you look at many of the films that we discussed today and many of the other films that are perhaps, similar recommendations, they're not necessarily like your typical horror film when it comes to like tropes. So it's only kind of within the extreme elements that they can fit into. And I think, extreme cinema as a whole often could be classified as not horror at all, but you watch it and you are horrified. You kind of go to bed at night and you go, that is worse than any slasher film I've seen, because you can relate it back to as Kelly and Lydia mentioned, like those real life aspects of it, the historical aspects of it, and the sad facts that a lot of these things maybe not have directly happened in the past, but are a great representation of the things that have happened in these countries.
Again, well said. Well said. Thank you. Better than I could definitely have ever put. So thank you. This is going to be so good. So let's jump into our first movie, probably the most famous out of the three, which is A Serbian Film from 2010. A family drama at its foundation, at its roots, an artistic exploitation film with subtext, I would say, commenting on the history and current state of Serbia. So I have quotes from each writer and director, just kind of to start off the conversation for you three. So from co-writer and director, I'm going to do my best with this name, Serjan Spazojevic. Extreme scenes such as the one with the baby are absolute literal images of how we feel. I never thought, let's make a shocking film, let's make it controversial, let's break the world record. That was never on our mind. We just wanted to express ourselves in the most honest and direct way possible. You're raped from birth and it doesn't even stop after your death. That's the point of the ending. A Serbian film. Wow. I feel like people that don't even really watch any of these movies, they know about a Serbian film, and I think for good reason. So who wants to start this off? Maybe I'll jump back over to Kelly McNeely, because her and I have definitely talked about this movie a bunch of times, and I know that you really enjoy it. So
I do. Yeah. I love that when this film was sort of first released, the director coaxed a bunch of audience members to join him on stage, where they like snorted a line of salt, squeezed lemon juice in their eye, and took shots of tequila in order to like understand what they've been through to create the culture of a Serbian film. So it's kind of an interesting film that, first off, I know we've discussed this before. I would love to see more movies that have dicks as a weapon, because fantastic. Love that. But I do love that it does kind of have this, while it's very directly related to Serbia and what happened with the Balkan Wars and all those horrible atrocities, it also kind of is universal, just discussing those themes of government involvement and the bigger themes of police brutality and things like that. When you take a look at some of the characters, the director, Vukmir, is kind of like very emblematic of the European film system. The character of the brother is a police officer, very symbolic as well, I think. You're kind of literally fucked by the system in a way. And one thing that he does kind of, that Spazojevic does kind of stress in the DVD commentary, I think in the UK, is that, again, this is a Serbian tale, but is also something that can be kind of looked at from other countries as well, and say like, hey, this is a thing that could happen, maybe has happened, not so directly as in terms of what exactly happens in the film. It's very much a sort of created version of it. It's an interpreted version of that. But I think that it's, because it's so well known, because it's so widely known, it's kind of a great introduction again to watching this film, hearing what it has to say about culture and in Serbia and that sort of theme, and doing a little bit more research into what exactly went on and why the director wanted to kind of explore those themes and explore those topics a little bit more.
Lydia, how about you? What Serbian film?
Yeah, in terms of it being a film up against so many other art house films as well, to create an intrinsically Serbian film was a goal from what I understand. And being a complete outsider, I couldn't say if they've accomplished it, but they've definitely accomplished an eye-opening moment probably around the world, to think this is what you think of the government in your country. This is what you think of past atrocities. This is how you will display that in art and get this through to people in a creative way. That's pretty intense. So what happened? I'm now interested in more Serbian history. And of course, it helps with the cultural melting pot that the world does slowly become with so much amazing immigration. We maybe understand the stories of people through the lens of art, and unfortunately through the lens of a very, very extreme film. There's a question near the end where we talk about other films, and I cannot wait to get there. But this particular film, when I first went to see it, it was in theater. I was one of the very lucky people to see it at the Mayfair Theater here. It's an grand old dame theater, I guess people call them. It's a repertoire theater, and it's wonderful for showing some very intense films. I've seen some very intense films there, but I did not walk. I ran to the Mayfair to see this. And it was the second day of its showing. And as I approached to purchase my ticket, the girl there said, I just want to make it very clear that you know what you're about to see. And I've never been stopped at a theater like that, like carded more or less. And I was like, yeah, I do. I've read reviews. I'm excited to see this film. And she's like, newborn porn? I'm like, yeah, I've heard all about it. And very excited to see it. She's like, okay, I just wanted to double check because we had a lot of very angry people here yesterday and a lot of walkouts. And it shocked me. I think that shocked me more than the whole film, really, because it was just like, how did you not know what you were going to see? And I felt bad for the people on one hand. On the other hand, it's like, be informed, and that's what this sort of art is all about, informing us about what other people are experiencing and how they're expressing this through art. So I was really lucky to see it in theater. I was so amazed and I loved it. I felt bad for the people that felt tricked into seeing something they didn't want to.
Right. I will say, I know the other Kelly and I have talked about how for ourselves, and I know for myself, watching a Serbian film, I mean, you're literally entitled a Serbian film. So I'm going to get what I'm going to assume is a Serbian experience. But watching this, watching Atroz, watching Trauma, I now want to seek out more information. Though these movies are very tough to watch, absolutely. I'm going to be very objective and say that, yes, they are. As much as I enjoy them, they educate me. And I can't, like, there's so many other extreme horror films or extreme cinematic experiences that, like, how many of them can say that? You know what I mean? So I love watching these movies from these different countries because, of course, they're going to have something very different to say. Their perspective, their lived experiences are going to be so different than us here in Canada or even the UK, right? So the educational aspect of it, I can't stress enough that I have found so interesting about them, because it's stuff that we wouldn't know about. How would we know about this? How would we know what the government's like in Serbia? I didn't learn about those wars in high school or at any point. It's all very important stuff to know. Anyways, Zoe, A Serbian Film, thoughts, feelings?
I mean, I love this film and I've watched it way too many times. And I like telling people that when they say I will never watch that again. I'm like, I'm on my 13th watch. I love this movie. But I just think it's such a great way. Like, I agree with what everyone has said, like such amazing points. And what you were just saying there, Kelly, about like, I would have no idea. And I still don't really know, the history of Serbia. I'm probably never going to learn about it, didn't learn about it at school. It's just not something that's ever come my way. But I think it's so great that, anyone can use like art, like cinema, as an outlet to present their frustrations with their government or with the way that the system is in their country. And I think it also, in a way, we might not really understand what's happened in Serbia, but seeing a film like A Serbian Film, you can then kind of look at that and see if there's any similarities between, the difficulties the people in that country have similar to yours. I mean, when I first saw A Serbian Film, I was at university, and a lecturer said, it's about getting fucked from birth, basically, like you said, until after death, which I think, like, here in the UK right now, we're currently in a cost of living crisis. And actually you can look at it that, people that are being born right now, they're being born into more poverty than ever. Like, people are absolutely fucked. They cannot, afford to live in certain parts of the country. And that rings true for so many countries around the world. So I think it's a great way, having films like A Serbian Film, in order to kind of connect with, other cultures and other communities and go, actually, I can see similarities and I can draw empathy on that and understand where they're coming from. Obviously, A Serbian Film does it in a very extreme way and goes, here's newborn porn, here is a baby getting destroyed, quite literally, unfortunately. But sometimes I think, to get a point across, how can you really show that and represent that without being quite literal and putting it in a very graphic and disturbing way? And I think we can all go, yeah, I get the point. So I just think it's like a phenomenal piece of filmmaking, which gets a lot of bad rep for, just that newborn porn thing.
Which is like, I think, an hour into the movie, and it's just like a moment, not minimalizing the scene, but there's so much more that happens in this movie. I think just because they're throwing out this massive taboo. And I mean, all of these movies hit checks like so many taboos off of the massive taboo list. But does anybody have any like favorite moments of the film that maybe is the most impactful, that, you know, that you like the most? Is there anything within A Serbian Film you want to specifically mention? Kelly, anything?
I think that one of the, well, there goes the dog. I think that one of the interesting elements that I read about when I was sort of, again, doing research on the Bosnian Wars and the Balkan Wars, just because I didn't know, and I wanted to kind of learn a little bit more about it, particularly after seeing this film, is a detail that I didn't really remember in the film until I kind of rewatched it, is that there's not really a lot of screaming in the film. There's not really a lot of reaction from the women as they're being, you know, raped and attacked. And that something that I read was apparently that was something that kind of really happened. Women would be taken and raped repeatedly and just would come back silent and like just have no response. So I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I think that that's a kind of a really empowering, or not empowering, but a powerful detail. Also, just the notoriety of this film, the fact that you can talk to anybody that hasn't seen this film and they will know like this is a really heavy, fucked up movie that like you should not see. It comes with that sort of weight to it. It comes with that that heavy toll that, again, sort of encourages people, I think, to read more about it. Like, I think I was talking to my sister about it and she's like, I'm not going to watch it, but I'm going to read about it on Wikipedia because I'm curious. And I love that there are some folks that will do that. They're like, I don't want to see it, but I want to know what it's about. And I kind of love that it also inspires that reaction in some people. In terms of moments that I think are the most memorable to me, again, gotta love a dangerous dick. Gotta love a dick through the eyeball. That's always one that stays with me.
Kelly.
It's one that always stays with me. But just, I mean, of course, like the whole ending scene, the whole ending sequence with the brother and the family. It's that last moment too. That very, very final scene is also one that always stays with me because it's, again, that you're fucked from birth right until after death. Like, I really love that ending. I think it's so powerful, but also so upsetting. And yeah, that always really sticks with me.
Yeah, I would agree. Lydia.
Yeah, the ending scene, of course, is so very powerful, like it is with a lot of really great movies, right? But they really not push the envelope, but it's like this is going to go on for in perpetuity, whatever. And this is not going to be the first or last family that this happens to because of this high rolling industry of these really high octane snuff sex filmmakers. And that's sort of a storyline that lives underneath the storyline of the family of the porn star and the family that we get to know. We really good character development in all these films. I think Serbian Film really takes the cake because you do feel for these characters. As long as you can park your feelings about extreme film and appreciate it as a film. There is that one scene, of course, newborn porn, which is not the most horrible scene in the film by far. It's the least gory. It's very short. It's the idea and the taboo nature, of course, is very hard hitting, but there are way more intense scenes. And I think the scene with the brother and the two covered victims is probably the most intense thing in the entire world that I've seen on film, really, because of my emotions linked to these characters that I've gotten to know and respect in one way and feel very poorly for in another, and kind of detest. And all of that is so magnetic. It's such a hard-hitting scene for me.
Fair. Zoe?
I actually really like some of the more subtle, I mean, I love all the really nasty ones, but I really like some of the more subtle scenes because for me, I feel like the film talks a lot about toxic masculinity and the portrayal between Peter and not Peter, sorry, that's the son, Milos and his brother, and how his brother is very envious of everything that Milos has. You know, he's constantly wondering why he does not love the fact that he is, you know, this amazing porn star, that he has a big penis. He's very obsessed with the fact that Milos is, you know, has women, can fuck anyone. And I think for me, a scene that I absolutely love is when the brother, and the name has escaped me right now, but the brother is with a prostitute in bed, and they are kind of like fumbling around. I think she's giving him head or something, and he's watching a home video of the family at Peter's birthday, and he constantly starts talking about, you know, how the fact that Milos could have any girl, could sleep with anyone, you know, has got everything. He's got, you know, the dream life, which actually on the flip side, continuously we see at the beginning of the film how Milos, you know, all he wants to do is be with his son and his wife. He doesn't want this supposed bravado, this supposed, you know, status that comes with being the world's greatest, most amazing porn star. He doesn't want to go out and fuck women anymore. He's got his dream woman at home, who he even says, you know, I don't want to fuck you like a whore or something like that. I want to make love to you. And for me, seeing his brother so obsessed with that, and kind of those differences between the two characters, I think it's such a great portrayal of toxic masculinity, and how, you know, clearly that in Serbia, that obviously growing up, there's this sense that you need to be, you know, this bravo man that gets all the women and can fuck them all. And, you know, Kelly, as you've spoken about, like dangerous dick, it's that kind of like a dick is an object to be used for violence, for sex, whereas to Milos, that, you know, that's not necessarily who he is at all. He's completely detached from that. And I just really like, you know, that scene for me is kind of hits the nail on the head.
Until driven to madness, and then he does use it for badness. I'd love to talk about this all day, but speaking of toxic masculinity, let's move on to our next film, Atroz, a disturbing look into the world of violence, homophobia, and paramilitarism. So a quote from director, producer, and actor, he plays lead Gaio in this film, Lex Ortega. Violence is part of human nature. Violence is part of Mexican culture. I think monsters are among us. I think we all have the possibility to become evil. We just might need an unfortunate event in our lives to detonate. This is the kind of horror that I like, and the topics I like to tell in my stories. The kind of evil that can be living next door. It could be one of our relatives, or it can be ourselves. Atroz. What a movie. What a movie. It's Kelly and I just had an extensive conversation about it, and I've written about it, and I find this one absolutely fascinating and absolutely destroying. This one has a lower rewatchability for me because I find it deeply upsetting and very, very sad, because I feel like it is more of like what's currently going on, instead of like trauma is more of like more historical, like a little bit more of what's going on in the past coming into the future, coming into the present, sorry. And like Serbia, again, a little bit more past coming into present day. But this is what's happening right now. This is our lived experience in Mexico. It is violent. There's people going missing all the time, like tens of thousands of unsolved murders. There's just something really, really dark and dangerous, and that's what they have to go through, and this is what they're living through. And then to throw in this idea of machismo in Mexico, which was, again, something I didn't know was really a big thing. But Atroz speaks to a lot of elements of Mexican culture. Kelly, I'll start with you again. Atroz.
Again, I do love that we just recently had this big conversation about this film, because it's such you brought it to my attention, this movie, and I'm glad you did, because it's such a heavy film, particularly in the ways that you were saying, where it's not about historical trauma, it's about present trauma. It's about culture that's going on currently, particularly in its treatment of, again, mentioned machismo. The LGBTQ plus community is very heavily featured in this film. One of the things I love about it as well that we kind of discussed is this combination of found footage and sort of presented narrative, or more traditional filmmaking, I should say, because it really makes the audience feel complicit in the violence when it's showing this found footage. You feel like you're involved, you feel like you're part of it. And for scenes like in the beginning, I think it's the first within the first like 15, 20 minutes or so, and they've got the sex worker, and they're like cutting open her chest and putting like human feces, I think her own feces, stuffing inside. Like, that's such a heavy, heavy, heavy scene. It's really hard to watch. It makes me feel physically ill. And I think this is one of the few films that does have that effect on me, that I feel physically nauseous when watching it. So well done, Lex Ortega. Again, it's touching on that whole community of the LGBTQ plus community in Mexico. I think in 2004, like 125 corpses of homosexuals were found. Only 75 were claimed by their relatives. And then for others, they didn't even go to the funerals, or they didn't go with the identification of them. They were just sort of not involved. And I know as well for, I can't remember when this number was taken, but something like only 4% of crimes or like assault against the LGBTQ plus community are reported, because everyone's just like, they're not going to do anything for me. What is the point in reporting this? I'm not going to say anything about this. So I do really appreciate Lex Ortega for bringing that element into this film, that is focused on machismo, that is focused on this paramilitary groups and this trauma and this violence, but it also addresses like, hey, there's this community that we're really fucking over in a big way, and like, this is a huge problem and we need to address it. And the way he does it, I think, is really well done. And it's also just like, same thing with A Serbian Film and also with Trauma, which we'll discuss in future. They're just really well made movies as well. Like, they look good, they sound good, and it kind of brings a air of almost legitimacy, I guess, to them, in the way that like you can look at it as an actual film that is well put together, and not just like a piece of trash that someone is willing to wave off because it's smutty or terrifying or, you know, etc.
Yeah. Lydia?
Is definitely one of the most dangerous feeling films I had seen in a long time. And it's nice to see that Extreme Film keeps chugging along, so to speak, because it felt like we were running low on really intense, very dark horror films. And Atroz came along. And at first I was kind of worried, in that it is presented to begin with is quite a bit of found footage. And it's like, uh-oh, are we gonna just turn into shaky handy cam? And yeah, it does turn into shaky handy cam in some ways, but it is so well stitched together. It is a master class film. And although if you edited out all the very intense scenes and made a movie, you would have a very presentable movie, but those intense scenes inform this plot so much. You need them. And you could explain the synopsis very briefly to someone and cut out all of the very intense things and have a very good story, but it's the intensity that really brings this movie home. And like you've said, it is now. And these aren't wounds from the past that they're dealing with through their art necessarily. These are things going on in the news right now. And it is very terrifying. It has the opposite effect of any sort of tourism or interest. I had recently read a book based in Mexico called The Hacienda. Really good book. It's like a Mexican Gothic, very different from Extreme, but it made me want to learn so much more about the abolished caste system and the haciendos. Like, very interesting cultural, historical glimpse for me. This makes you not want to look. And that's the problem with what is going on in the streets of Mexico and many countries, is that people aren't looking and they're not paying attention. They're not reporting. They feel unseen, and they are the less dead. And the less dead problem there is so much bigger than many more prosperous countries, I suppose, with better police, because the police in this, much like the previous film we talked about, A Serbian Film, are no help at all.
No, they're corrupt. So far, 2 out of 3 films, corrupt cops not doing their job. Absolutely. And it's such a big problem. Like, there's even problems here in Canada with our police system. Let's not go into that. But yeah, Zoe, Atroz. I don't think I know your thoughts on Atroz, so this is very exciting to me.
I am pretty sure that I blanked this film out of my mind because I was like, nah, I don't need that in there. Like, I'm good. Yeah, so I rewatched it, and I genuinely think it's worse than A Serbian Film. Like, it is so hard to watch the whole thing in one sitting. Like, I actually took a break. I was like, do you know what? I need to like do something nice in the middle of this, because it's really upsetting. I think whilst a film like A Serbian Film is very disturbing and it is upsetting, it doesn't have that kind of like highly offensive element to it. You know, I was describing this film earlier, and I did put in all the intense scenes for my partner, and I said, you know, one of the most upsetting things there is like the derogatory words that are used in there, you know, which I find like really hard to listen to, and I'm sure people within those communities, if they were to watch it, like that could really kind of like impact you and feel very, very triggering. So it is a film that I think is really hard to watch. I probably would struggle to recommend it to a lot of people, because, you know, it's just not something that you go into lightly. I think you do really need to go, am I okay to watch something like this? And, you know, obviously having that found footage element, as we've seen with other films like something like August Underground, as you said, Kelly, you know, it makes you feel complicit to what's going on. You're right there. You cannot escape from seeing this violence right in front of you. And I think, you know, the elements of machismo in there are very strong. And seeing that, it actually reminded me of another film I watched quite recently, which is another Mexican film called The Untamed, which is a science fiction film, but it also looks at, you know, people that are, you know, homosexual themselves, not coming to terms with that, and living in a place like Mexico where it's not really something you go around about and shout about, and that coming through to fruition in violence against the person that actually they're sexually attracted to, because they have been taught that the only way to solve this, you know, presentable problem in their culture, society, is through violence. And I think, you know, it's exactly the same in Atroz. And yeah, it's a really, really hard film to watch.
Thank you. Oh, that movie, The Untamed, sounds like a great double feature. Great if you really want to ruin your day double feature. So thank you for that. I'm going to try to find that one, scope that one out.
I do have a point that I
Yes,
just wanted to toss in, and I don't know if I was blind to it. One thing I did notice that seemed to be glaringly missing from Atroz is the presence of any sort of religious iconography. I know that Mexico is a very religious country, and the people are very, very, there's a lot of very big Christian and also Santerian groups. So I was I was taken aback that, okay, if I were to be walking around these areas in Mexico, would I not notice religious iconography like I've come to expect that I would see? Is it just me, or did that stand out to anyone else, or did I miss it?
I would say it wasn't glaringly obvious when I've watched it a few times, but now that you bring it up, yes, that is a glaring omission that I feel like maybe that was intentional, but I don't know. I mean, that's like another layer of all of this, right? Is how deeply
God
religious
is not here.
No, maybe that's it, right? Because that country is, deeply religious, which a lot of where that homophobia is going to come in as well. It's very sinful. You even see that with the conversation with the mother and the father, with Goyo's mother and father being like, he is perverted. This is sinful. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? But that is a great, great point that it was very much missing, but maybe that was a point. There's not a lot of interviews with Lex Ortega, so that would be something interesting to ask. Kelly, Zoe, any thoughts on that?
I think that I hadn't thought about that point as well, but that's a very, very good point. Goyo seems like a very godless man to me, so maybe that was very intentional. Or also, I mean, I guess if they had brought it in, that element into it, it would have really colored it in a very big way in terms of like what sort of arguments they're making and what they're saying about the church as well, which would have potentially been like a very interesting way to kind of mesh that in too, because like you said, like it is such a huge part of the culture, but it's something that's not present in this film at all. It's, again, God is not here, not even in the colon cam. just not there. Yeah. So I hadn't thought about that. That's a very good point.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe because there was already so much there, that would just be like another massive element that they didn't want to throw in. I'm not sure. Zoe, any little thoughts on that?
No, I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, I agree. It's a very good point, because I know, you know, obviously religion is a huge thing there, but yeah, I think I just agree on the point that God clearly is not there at all. So perhaps the absence speaks louder than having it in there.
Love that. Let's move on to a traumatizing movie. My favorite of the three, Trauma from 2017 from Chile. A very confronting film, I think quite authentically historical, of Chilean military history. There's elements of sexuality, there's queer characters, there's generational abuse, generational trauma. And here's a quote from writer-director Lucio Rojas. As a Chilean, we are aware of what we have experienced because of the brutal dictatorship of General Pinochet that we had for 17 years. Sorry. We all know the atrocities and abuses committed in one of the most sadistic, violent, and cruel dictatorships in history. Tens of thousands of tortured and thousands of disappeared, and worst of all, impunity for these acts. In addition, we live in a country, or rather a continent, where sexual abuse towards women is a daily occurrence, and we are immersed in a very aggressive, violent society that respects our neighbor less every day. This is why everything that surrounds Latin Americans is sordid, dirty, and one grows in socially difficult environments. Violence is part of our existence, and we tried to capture it most truthfully in our cinema. Trauma. With a banger soundtrack, that an incredible score that looks and sounds better maybe than it deserves to be. I don't know, but I feel like it's the best looking, the best created, and it is my favorite. I find it probably like Atroz, then Trauma, and then A Serbian Film for most disturbing. Like, I remember when I watched Trauma for the first time, in the first 5 minutes, you're set up for the tone of the rest of the movie. And if you can get past those first 5 minutes, you're golden. Doesn't mean it gets better, but you can withstand the rest of the movie. And I remember watching this for the first time and texting Kelly and be like, whoa, people think A Serbian Film is bad? I literally just watched the first 5 minutes of Trauma. But I love this movie. This one, I think, has incredible rewatchability. I think it's deeply interesting and disturbing and wonderful in a lot of ways. So let's talk about Trauma. Kelly, again, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I feel like Lucio Rojas saw A Serbian Film and was like, hold my beer. Because really with this film, from the newborn porn to everything that Augusto Pinochet did, the most horrifying part of this film is that really it is all kind of based on real tortures and things that actually happened. I think there was something like 40,000 people tortured, 2,000 some odd hundred people executed. The methods of torture ranged from, there was something called the grill, where they would strap someone to a metal bed and electrocute them, and then put a loved one or a friend up on the top bunk, and they'd be simultaneously tortured and just like hear each other screaming. And it's like horrible, horrible things. Live rats being inserted places that they should not be inserted. Yeah, horrible, horrific things. And again, the fact that everything in this movie really comes from that. I love the generational trauma aspect of this film, because I feel like that's something that really is very impactful. And it's kind of terrifying when you realize that Pinochet's regime ran from like 1973 to 1990. This was not a long time ago. This was like within the last 50 years. And that's horrific and really kind of shocking, because you hear about these type of atrocious acts and you think like, oh, that must have been like what, like 100 some odd years ago, and people didn't know any better. It's like, no, this was in the 90s. Like, that's insane. And again, the generational trauma kind of reflects on that and brings in the fact that they have someone that would have been of that age now. Because again, these people weren't really brought to justice. Not a lot was done about it. And people kind of did these atrocious acts and then just kind of continued living their lives. And that's a horrifying thought. Again, like Kelly said, this is a really well-made film. It's a stunning film. It's a kind of banger soundtrack. And it's just kind of really shocking. I remember the first time I watched it, and I was immediately like, I have to tell somebody about this, and I don't know who to tell about this movie because, like, and I think I told you because I was like, I need to talk to somebody about this because someone needs to know about this movie because it's so heavy, and the scenes of sexual assault are so jarring and harrowing, and it just unforgivable as well. Like it just locks in your, I think, close-up shot through the whole thing as well. You're not looking away, it's unflinching. Yeah, it's also just got some really crazy special visual effects, like again, we were mentioning earlier, like the jaw being torn off, and there's a lot of thoughts I have about this movie, and I'm never really sure how exactly to communicate them because most of them are just unintelligible noises. But it always sticks with me, particularly, like I said, because it is true and it's real, and it's not like a Serbian film, sort of an interpretation of feelings about these events and things like that. It's like, no, these events happened, and like this is really kind of, these atrocities went on, and this is how people were tortured and went through this, and we can't forget about that fact.
I feel like that group of women that seems like very fun and progressive and everything is great just they step into the past.
Yeah.
Like they go into this little villa to have a great weekend and they're stepping into their past, and it's rough. Lydia?
It is definitely rough. I like how this list of films has gone to something with a Serbian film where you get, maybe 20, 30 minutes into the film before it's really getting uncomfortable to watch. And then into Atroz where you got a little bit of warm up, got a little bit of time before they're dumping nail polish remover in a severed breast. But then you get here and wow. Yeah, the first 5 minutes is extremely rough. It is probably the most extreme first few minutes of a film that I've ever seen. And it really sticks with you because it is so well scripted, acted, written, lit, filmed, everything. It is really the holy grail of extreme horror film, especially when it's coming to this cultural extreme. The idea that these are based on true facts and true torture methods, it's you don't want to believe it. And a lot of these torture methods have been used worldwide by terrible people, but to have them all sort of boiled down into one place and having gone on for so long under the eyes and auspices and guides of other countries that should be very embarrassed by their involvement and should actually be held to account for their involvement or support of this sort of behavior, makes it even more terrifying. Like it is probably the most extreme film, not just because of the first 5 minutes. The effects are amazing. Like I agree that jaw being ripped, you don't see anything quite like that. It is fairly quick. They don't linger, but they linger on a lot of the other gore that we see. And there are some effects at the very, very end of the film that are so well done after being treated to this very depraved story of a depraved individual wreaking havoc on these people that you can probably relate to better than most people in these films. It's very unsettling. And then on top of that, you've got these really good effects, even with a couple dream sequences, but I'll forgive them that.
Zoe, trauma.
Yeah, those first 5 minutes I feel like it's like a make or break. A friend told me that he watched it at, I think it was, they programmed it at Fright Fest here in London, UK, without kind of, fully mentioning what it was going to be. And unfortunately, my friend, he's quite well versed in extreme cinema, but he said that there was a lot of people that just went, fuck no, and got up and left. And I was like, yeah, I can see why. Like, again, another film that I would not recommend to people because unless you kind of like that type of cinema, because it is so hard to get through those first 5 minutes. But I think, the film is, just to echo everyone else here, is, so well made. It's such a great movie in itself, and it does such a good job at portraying, these atrocities that happened. And I think, picking up on one of the points that someone said a minute ago, is that, like going back in time, it's almost like a representation of how we, in many kind of like civilized and modern places, like here in London, outside of my head, I'm like, nothing that awful is still going on around the world. But then, as we see in Trauma, we see these girls, they do go to this place and they're very progressive, and then they go to somewhere that is completely the opposite. And I think it's a great, reflection on the world we still live in today, that whilst we might live in our little bubbles and kind of go like, oh, it's not too bad, it's not that awful, you then look at, as we spoke about in Atroz, places like Mexico, where actually there are really bad things happening. And it is kind of like, for me, that living in London, I forget that there's awful places and people doing awful things, and that is all dictated to them by history. And I think the other element of Trauma that I really love, which again was kind of like seen in Atroz, is that cycle of violence, in the fact that, in Trauma we see like dad and son, which in Atroz you obviously see Goyu, that he is abused by his parents, and the way that he is treated, this violence against him, he carries on into his life, and so does his sister, as we find out. And again in Trauma, it's the same thing. It's that kind of, and again also A Serbian Film, is kind of that representation of, you fuck children from the day they're born, and they will then go on to fuck their children. And that is a cycle of violence and atrocities that kind of doesn't have an end to it. And I think Trauma shows that in a very literal sense. And it's very sad.
Oh, I loved that. Thank you, Zoe. I'm obsessed with the editing choices and the contrasting scene choices in Trauma, particularly where they have the best song of the movie playing with the girls and the striptease of one of our queer characters juxtaposed and going back and forth to a sex scene of Juan and his family, his depraved, messed up, misplaced family. And like, I'm obsessed with that scene because it's so messed up but so well done, and it just shows these like completely different worlds. It's like the colors, the way it's created and filmed, both those scenes, again, so very different. The bright, the warmth, that house, that villa that the girls are staying in, and then the blues and the darkness and like the candlelight and the like basement cold feeling of where Juan and his family lives. It's like, I'm just obsessed with it. It's such a stunning scene. So love Trauma. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to my last question, which is, because I always want to know more, what other films would you classify as cultural extremism? Only one I can think comes to mind, but I haven't watched it yet due to animal cruelty in it that I'm just not ready to watch, which is Men Behind the Sun, which is all based off, again, a real thing that happened, Japan's Unit 731 experiments. I have not watched it, so I can't necessarily fully comment on it, but I feel like if I had to think, that would be a great choice for showing us some very extreme environments of stuff that literally happened in a country. So, Kelly, any other recommendations lightly, but any other options?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of New French Extremity, of course, that kind of deals with that type of thing, particularly Frontiers, which is really kind of set during the Paris riots and also deals with the Nazi occupation in a big way. So that's kind of the first one that came to mind for me. Baskin from Turkey. I love that film. It's such a great movie. I was going to say Men Behind the Sun, so I'm glad you mentioned that one too. And then in a more sort of historically, like not historically, but like specific sense. Angst, which was kind of based on a serial killer, I think Werner Kneisek, and then also The Golden Glove, which is based on Franz Honka from Germany. So I think those ones, again, just, there's a little very, very specific corner of dealing with very specific moments of history and serial killers. But to me, Frontiers is like the big one that I always kind of come back to. Yeah.
Nice. That's like one of the few new French extremities that I have not seen. So I should bump that up to the top of my list. I remember you and I, Kelly, talking about this a while ago, but there was an American show that came out recently that you thought might fit into it. Was it called Them? I don't know because I didn't watch it, but it was more like American history. So it'd be like an American extreme.
Yes. Yeah, that was one. I think it was Them, which I don't think I have seen all of it, but I remember reading about like how it does deal with a lot of themes with like segregation in the States, and there's some really rough torture scenes from what I understand. So that was another one that I was thinking about. But again, having not seen it, I didn't want to comment too much on it. But that's one that I remember when I was reading about it, I was like, oh, this sounds like cultural extremism to me.
Yeah.
I remember reading it. A lot of people were very upset about that show. And I think that was kind of the reason why, is maybe they weren't exactly prepared for that, because I feel like cultural extremism, while there's a lot of obviously really rough history in the United States, it's not necessarily something we see coming out of the US as often as maybe European or other countries.
Yeah. Lydia, what other movies do you think you would classify as cultural extremism?
Definitely on my list is Men Behind the Sun. And I find it's a very tiring and very long film. And I wish that they would give it the same treatment that we've gotten for Cannibal Holocaust, where there are some of the scenes with animal cruelty cut out so that people can, I hesitate to say enjoy the movie, but have that as a touchstone for a very important and very dark time in history. So that was definitely on my list. 120 Days of Saddam, very similar sort of idea, not quite as heavy with the torture, more psychological torture, truly, and poop. But that is another one that's quite famous, of course, for that. Yeah. And because we don't really know as much about Italian fascism during the Second World War as I think that we ought to. For an American, more contemporary idea, Pig by Adam Mason, and it's not as readily available from what I understand. And I was treated to a screening of that because my husband used to run a podcast called Bind Torture Cast, which covered extreme film for many, many years. And he had interviewed Adam Mason, and he had offered, if anyone listening, go and use this to code and you can access this film. And it was probably one of the most intense films, and it has a lot to say, much like something like Hostel talks about American money buying people to do horrible, torturous things with for fun. Unlike all these films that we've talked about, where it is an atrocity and people were victimized and traumatized, they're doing this for fun. So it's sort of the flip side of that. Pig is a kind of a tough watch too, only because it's so intense. It's all done in one take. So as much as the first 5 minutes of Trauma is very hard to get through, it's hard to get this relentless brutality on screen with no pause and not even a cut. It's a bit intense.
Wow.
Snowtown is an interesting one, although it's not an extreme film. It's an extreme idea. Yeah, I see everyone nodding. I mean, yeah. Snowtown's hard to watch. It's very hard to watch. And while it might not be extreme as far as its special effects or gore or any of those things, it is harrowing. And on top of that, with some gore too, Seasoning House, Paul Hyatt's film, The Seasoning House is so intense. And it does, I believe, deal with the Serbian and Serb-Croat war. And during that time, some of the things that soldiers were doing. And it is a very sexual assault heavy, very intense story as well, and extremely sad. But that really always comes to mind when it's the atrocities of war, The Seasoning House.
Oof, I got a watch list growing. Some of these I have seen, but I want to like rewatch them in this kind of scope and perspective. So Zoe? Whew.
I just have to say, I'm so glad that I found someone else that's seen Pig, because We must talk about it at some point because yes, I agree. It's a very upsetting film, and I believe that Mason even said himself that he did not want anyone to see it after the initial screenings because he thought it was so depraved. So that goes to show just how nasty it is. So I've also got quite a few similar ones. So Men Behind the Sun, of course, like, yeah, absolutely. 120 Days of Sodom is always on there as well. For me as well, films like In a Glass Cage and The Painted Bird as well. They are obviously deeply, deeply, deeply upsetting films, and The Painted Bird is also a book, which I haven't read the book, I've seen the film, but yeah, just very upsetting in their kind of portrayal of course, war atrocities. I think no matter how you approach those topics, they're always going to be some of the most, you know, horrendous that are out there. Another one that I actually haven't finished because I found it so upsetting and disturbing to watch was Orozco the Embalmer, which is actually more of a documentary, but you see a lot of real dead bodies, including, you know, discarded dead babies on the street. Very tough to watch. And again, I did not finish that. I was like, I'm tapping out on this one. But yeah, a great representation of that. And then I guess something for the UK that kind of springs to mind that, whilst fabricated, I think is a good kind of representation of a lot of, you know, government and political issues we've had here is Threads, which again is a very, very bleak watch, which I know, Kelly, you watched once and texted me and was like, fuck no. And I was like, yeah.
Oh my God. Threads. Like just a BBC film coming out on TV. And I was like, what? This came in. So it came out on, I saw it available on Tubi TV, where I watch a lot of these movies, oddly enough, but like terrified. Like I don't feel scared often, but that movie scared the crap out of me. Just the details that went into making that film. Yeah, if they wanted to scare us, don't watch it maybe right now during this political climate. It's a little spooky, but like, wowzers. Threads. Oh my God. Again, that's one I've probably tried to like shelve away because it terrified me so much. Good recommendations. Some of these I didn't even like really even think about. So thank you. Massive watch list, folks watching at home. You got some movies to watch. So I didn't see any questions come up in the comments, but I'll just leave the floor open for 5 seconds for sake of timing. But if anybody has any questions for anybody here, myself included, on this panel about these movies or anything, send them in now, because if not, I'm going to wrap up and end this panel for today. But, oh man, this has been fantastic with so many great points, great insight. Lydia, welcome to this nasty team. I had no idea. This is like our first meeting and me first like hearing about you, and you just have an incredible, it seems like, love or at least interest of extreme cinema. So you are definitely welcome to sit with us here, and we'll be chatting in the future. That's for sure. That's for sure.
And one thing I did just want to mention as well that I think Jess just unmuted me, so thanks, is one of the things that I love about the horror genre in general is cultural extremism is such a fantastic way to look at specific history and about specific events. But I think that one of the really cool things about foreign horror and about horror everywhere is that it really kind of encompasses the themes and the traumas and the all the fears that we have culturally for each country that films come from. Themes like when you look at a lot of Spanish films, they have, I mean, there's Who Could Kill a Child, I think, and then there's a lot of like Kidnapped is a big one. New French Extremity, of course, has all of that stuff about a fear of the other and about isolation. So basically what I was trying to say is that I think it's really cool when you look at each country that their themes in horror kind of reflect the cultural fears, reflect the cultural history, and reflect the ideas of the mythology that they sort of encompass. So it's kind of a really cool way to learn more about different cultures, as well as looking at their horror films and saying like, okay, so what fears are they exploring today, and what does that say about their history and about their culture, and how can I learn a little bit more about that? So I love that you've sort of come up with this cultural extremism title for it, when it looks at the more heavily influenced films. But yeah, I think this is sort of a cool idea with cultural horror in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And that's why I think I usually love foreign films more than North American films, because I don't know, this is my life here. It's going to be less interesting because this is just what my day-to-day experience is like, right? But something from Japan or Chile or Mexico, like, I don't know. I want to know. I didn't know, but now I want to know. I want to know what you're experiencing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling. And then because how they create that put that into a film, again, is going to be very different than how we do in Canada or America, like in North America. So I love that. Like, I watched a Japanese film, which I'm never disappointed when I watch a movie from Japan. It was called X-Cross. I watched it this morning, and wild, just wild. I love the choices they make in putting their films. But anyway, so we have a couple of questions from Jack. Since 2017, any new movies to add to this list? I'm terrible with dates. I don't know. I don't know what's come out. I don't know if there's anything that's come out in like the last 5 to 6 years that would necessarily be considered cultural extremism. Again, it's about exploring different countries, right? And getting into their film and seeing what they're producing. But I can't really think anything off the top of my head, if anybody has anything.
Yeah, one that I actually just published a review for last night for Fantasia Fest 2022. It's called Megalomaniac, and it's a film from Belgium. And again, it's like very specific cultural horror and history. It's sort of exploring the there's this serial killer in Belgium called the Butcher of, I think it was Butcher of Mons. I can't remember exactly where it's from, but he was never caught. They found several garbage bags full of women's bodies across the side of the road over a period of like 7 or 10 years or something like that. Good. But this sort of takes his 2 children and follows them as adults and how they've sort of grown with this, again, generational trauma, and how it's affected them, and how they sort of live and don't live. And it's a really interesting movie. I really liked it a lot. It was very heavy, very beautifully done as well. It's like gorgeously created. So I really enjoyed that one. I recommend it to anyone that likes anything that's a little bit heavier, and also a little bit more creative in its presentation.
Great. I don't know when the Golden Glove came out, but I feel like that was after 27th. There we go. So there's that's another one. Yeah. Anybody else have any like new examples? I don't know what Chris is bringing up. A Man Called Horse. I have not seen that. I've never heard of it, so I can't comment on that.
The only one that maybe kind of fits into it, I would say, is potentially The Scary of 61st. Because obviously it looks at Jeffrey Epstein and everything that happened around that. Of course, it's a deeply offensive and upsetting film, and I think I can absolutely see why a lot of people are outraged. And I wrote an article about it recently for the new release of the film, and I compared it in similar ways to A Serbian Film, because of course it takes this topic, and actually what the film does itself is kind of adds a sexual lens to it, and almost like a satirical kind of narrative on top of it, which considering a topic like Jeffrey Epstein, which certainly for I think UK and US audiences has shocked things. It's quite a film.
Haven't seen it. I'm going to throw that on top of my list. Absolutely. Thank you. Lydia, is anything coming to mind for you?
I'm so bad with titles. I know there's a few films, a Brazilian film that I know we watched. I could run upstairs and take a look or ask my husband, but I'm not going to do that. One that wasn't necessarily extreme, but it depends on what gets to you, right? Sleepless Beauty, and it deals with sleep deprivation and kidnapping of women. So I found it a little harrowing. It's maybe not the best movie in the entire world, but it's definitely out since 2017. And I swore to God that Carcinoma by Marian Dora was newer than it is, but it came out in 2014. So yeah, I lose the game.
That's fair. Zeddy has a really great question here. So do you all see the uptick in, quote, trauma horror in North America as of the last few years indicative of a possible extremism and cultural extremism rise in the next few years? As in, have you noticed yourselves a shift in viewings of these types of films or desires for these types of films in North America or the West? I would say I have not noticed any of it because it's so very niche. And I'm also sometimes terrible at watching new movies that come out. Anybody thoughts on that?
I think that I like the term trauma horror because I think it also kind of can be very broad. Like trauma horror could include Hereditary and movies like that
Right.
have to deal with like personal trauma and emotional trauma as well as it could deal with cultural trauma as well. I think that because the world has been going through some shit in the last couple of years, it's been having a bit of a time. I will not be surprised if I see some more films that are kind of dealing with those heavier themes and exploring those darker pockets of humanity, because I feel like, I don't know if it's something we all need, but I feel like it's something that kind of fills that darkness and that we've all been kind of feeling over the past couple of years again. It's been a bit of a rough go for planet Earth. Not that there's ever really been a great time for planet Earth, let's be honest, it's always been a little rocky. But I think that because perhaps there's been more extreme horror films coming out of Europe and Asian countries and it's basically elsewhere other than North America, I wouldn't be surprised if they're like, hey, we can kind of do some of that too. I'd be very curious to see what kind of themes they pick up and what kind of cultural traumas they decide to run with.
I feel like maybe because of the pandemic, with a lot of social issues being much more, let's say, spoken about, I know I've become a hell of a lot more aware of the holes in a lot of places here in Canada with our justice system, with our political system, with our social system, our medical system, many layers. I feel like out of the pandemic, we might start seeing more of these types of films. So putting my thinking cap on, I think the pandemic, I'm hoping maybe less of like the spooky pandemic horror like host, but like shit got really real for a lot of us. And it was just, we had less time to be distracted by our bubbles and our outside world and shit that maybe doesn't matter, that all we had time for was, we'll call it doom scrolling, but it was education. Knowing what was going on, Black Lives Matter, all the shit going on in the US with the LGBTQ communities, where we have less of our distractions in our lives and our world, that we've been able to focus more on these issues that have always been there, but now more people are aware of it. So I'm hoping maybe we start to see some films about that come out. Right. I think.
Oh, I do have a response for that.
Oh, yes, please. Yes.
Yeah,
I was just looking at the
waiting.
comments, see if there's anything else
yeah.
there. Please do.
No problem. With that particular one, like we've gone from don't ask, don't tell to if you see something, say something in the matter of a couple decades. And there is like a generational learning curve with these things, definitely. So with more things being on Front Street, as it were, I think that there's more fodder for these sorts of stories. And it's not as, we don't worry so much perhaps as creators, because we weren't the first men on the moon, so to speak, when it comes to these things. There's a rich catalog of extreme film before us. So we've sort of had those waters tested. So now we can tell our stories and maybe not worry about having to be the first person to talk about something in film, where we can explore it now, not just present it, but explore it. And I think that decade by decade that grows. And there's also that mirror of what's going on in the print world, in books and novels and literature, as opposed to the film. Many years ago, it used to take 10 years for a book to come to screen, and now it can be instantaneous. It can be very close together. And the splatterpunk and extreme fiction world is booming and has been for quite some time. And the stories that they're telling there are very contemporary. So it's not going to be too long before a lot of those are adapted, I feel.
Cool. That'd be great. I know Zoe is a big reader of a lot of these types of like more transgressive books. So yeah, hopefully we get to see some of those and film for those that don't read as much. Yeah. We have one last question and then we're going to be done here. So Glamour Ghoul, potential lightning round question. Let's do it. I love this. Is there any particular scene from a disturbing film that stands out to you as the, quote, most memorable? Kelly, go.
Most of Trauma, particularly the scene where they break into the house. That whole sequence always stands out to me whenever I think of that movie. It's like,
yep. Lydia.
Dumplings. Eating dumplings. Anyone eating anything? Brushing your teeth? I'm out there. Disgusting, but dumplings. Eating dumplings.
Zoe.
August Underground bathtub scene.
There you go. For me, I would say Snowtown strangling in the bathtub. All right, that's that. Okay, so thank you all, thank all of you so much for taking time out of your busy days to come hang out and talk about these wonderfully disturbing films and this wonderful and my favorite topics, cultural extremism. And thank you to Jess in the background, my tech gremlin. Was a mogwai. I fed her last night. Whatever. She's a gremlin now. So she's been wonderful. But before we wrap up for the day, there is a big announcement that finally we can actually talk about. Launching officially next month, or at least the first episode will be out next month, but launching essentially right now, is a brand new podcast created by myself and panelist Zoe Smith.
Woo!
Woo-hoo! The Queen of Extreme meets Kelly's Taboo Terrors in a gorecast featuring all kinds of disturbing films. It's a show created by two women whose bloody obsession is with all things nasty. So stay tuned for the launch episode coming soon.
yay.
Yay!
Congratulations.
It's the end of Zobo the Shotgun, but the rebirth of Zoe. So yes, officially can say that now. So folks, everybody who's joined in, thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope you all come back here tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern time. There we go. 12 p.m. Eastern time for the next panel on Extreme Essentials, the Guinea Pig series. So until then, stay grim. Have a good time.